Mr. President, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Great to see you.
This is a critical moment in the health care debate, and you've been able to assess the landscape. You've got a bill now that's working its way through the Senate. You've spoken to Congress. As you assess the situation, I wonder whether you approach this with a minimum threshold of what you'll accept for reform, or at this point have you said, I've laid out my plan, take it all or nothing?
You know, I think that my focus is on some core principles. I have to have a plan that is good for middle-class families who we know last year ended up seeing a 5.5% increase in their premiums, even though inflation was actually negative on everything else, that have seen a doubling of their premiums over the last decade, that are less secure than ever in terms of the insurance they can actually count on, and more of them can't get insurance because of pre-existing conditions, or they changed jobs, or they lost jobs. So it's got to be good for them. Now, the principles that we've talked about, making sure that there's an insurance exchange that allow people to buy in and get health insurance and negotiate as a big pool to drive down costs, making sure that we have insurance reforms that make sure you can still get health insurance even if you've got a pre-existing condition, and cap out-of-pocket expenses and so forth. Those core things that make insurance a better deal for American consumers. Making sure that it's deficit neutral, both now and in the future. Making sure that it's driving down healthcare inflation so that we can actually deal with our long-term budget deficits. Those are the core principles that are critical to me. And I actually think that we've agreed to about 80% of that. If you look at all the bills that are coming through all these committees, the key is now just to narrow those differences. And if I don't feel like it is a good deal for the American people, then I won't sign a bill.
Those narrow differences can also, in some cases, be very big differences. And as you were president-elect last year, you said to the nation, in light of the huge challenges that the country faces, you said, we're going to have to make hard choices, and not all of these choices are going to be popular. What are the hard choices that you are now asking the American people to make? And who are you going to say no to in order to get health care done?
Well, I've already made some pretty substantial changes in terms of how I was approaching health care. When I was
like the public option, you effectively said to the left, well, that's not going to happen.
No, that's not true. What I've said is that public option, I think, should be a part of this, but we shouldn't think that somehow that's the silver bullet that solves health care. What I've said, for example, on what's called an individual mandate. During the campaign, I said, look, if health care is affordable, then I think people will buy it. So we don't have to say to folks, you know what, you have to buy health care. And when I talk to health care experts on both the left and the right, what they tell me is that even after you make health care affordable, there's still going to be some folks out there who, whether out of inertia or they just don't want to spend the money, would rather take their chances. Unfortunately, what that means is then you and I and every American out there who has health insurance and are paying their premiums responsibly every month, they've got to pick up the cost for emergency room care when one of those people gets sick. So what we've said is, as long as we're making this genuinely affordable to families, then you've got an obligation to get health care, just like you have an obligation to get auto insurance in every state.
Are these the hard choices, though? Who are you saying no to?
I mean, that's an example of a hard choice, because that's not necessarily wildly popular, but it's the right thing to do. I have said that it is very important that we take into account the concerns of doctors and nurses, who, by the way, support our efforts. And that's something that doesn't get noticed much. The people who are most involved in the healthcare system know that it's got to be reformed. But I've said that we've got to take into account their concerns about medical malpractice. Now, that's not popular in my party, never has been. But I've talked to enough doctors to know that even though it's not the end-all, be-all of driving down healthcare costs, it's very important to providers to make sure that their costs are going down. So I think there are going to be a whole series of Republican ideas from my opponents during the campaign that we have incorporated and adopted And this is hard. One of the things I've always said is, if this had been easy, it would have been taken care of by Teddy Roosevelt.
You're not really taking on, I mean, you're not saying to the left they've got to accept malpractice reform or caps on jury awards. You don't even think that contributes to the escalating cost of health care. What are you really doing to say to the left, look, you may not like this, but you got to get on board or we got to do this?
Well, listen, I think I was awfully clear, and I'm surprised, David, maybe you haven't been paying attention to what both the left and the right have been saying about my speech to Congress. I laid down some pretty clear parameters, and what I said was we're going to take ideas from both sides. The bottom line is that the American people can't afford to stay on the current path. We know that, and that both sides are going to have to give some. Everybody's going to have to give some in order to get something done. We wouldn't have gotten this far if we hadn't been pretty insistent, including to folks in my own party, that we've got to get past some of these ideological arguments to actually make something happen.
This healthcare debate, as you well know, can sometimes be about bigger things. And among your harshest critics is the view somehow that government is out of control. And in some cases, it's gotten very personal. Your election to a lot of people was supposed to mark America somehow moving beyond race. And yet this week you had former President Jimmy Carter saying most, not just a little, but most of this Republican opposition against you is motivated by racism. Do you agree with that?
No. Look, I said during the campaign, are there some people who still think through the prism of race when it comes to evaluating me and my candidacy? Absolutely. Sometimes they vote for me for that reason, sometimes they vote against me for that reason. I'm sure that was true during the campaign. I'm sure that's true now. But I think you actually put your finger on what this argument's really about, and it's an argument that's gone on for the history of this republic, and that is, what's the right role of government? How do we balance freedom with our need to look after one another? I talked about this in the joint session speech. This is not a new argument, and it always invokes passions. It was a passionate argument between Jefferson and Hamilton about this. Andrew Jackson built a whole political party around this notion that somehow there's populist outrage against a federal government that was intrusive. And so what I think is going on is that we've got a healthy debate taking place. The vast majority of people are conducting it in a very sensible way. I think that every president who's tried to make significant changes along these lines, whether it was FDR or Ronald Reagan, elicit very strong, passionate responses. But I do think that we all have an obligation to try to conduct this conversation in a civil way and to recognize that each of us are patriots, that each of us are Americans, and that, by the way, my proposals, as much as you may not like them, if you're a Republican or on the right, recognize that this is well within the mainstream of what Americans have been talking about for years in terms of making sure that everybody in this country gets decent health care and that people who have health care are protected.
Just to be clear, though, It wasn't just President Carter. There are others in the Congressional Black Caucus, other thinkers who have said that they agree that there is racism out there in that opposition too. I just want to be clear. Are you saying to the former president and others to speak this way is counterproductive?
Well, look, David, here's what I'm saying. I think that the media loves to have a conversation about race. I mean, this is catnip to the media because it is a running thread in American history that's very powerful, and it evokes some very strong emotions. I'm not saying that race never matters in any of these public debates that we have. What I'm saying is this debate that's taking place is not about race. It's about people being worried about how our government should operate. Now, I think a lot of those folks on the other side are wrong. I think that they have entirely mischaracterized the nature of our efforts, and I think it's important that we stay focused on solving problems as opposed to plucking out a sentence here or a comment there, and then the entire debate, which should be about how do we make sure middle-class families have secure health care, doesn't get consumed by other things.
In that vein,
Yeah.
House Speaker Pelosi worried about the opposition, the tone of it perhaps leading to violence, as it did in the 70s. There's more recent examples of anti-government violence occurring even in the mid-90s. Do you worry about that?
Well, look, I think that we have an obligation in Washington as leaders to make sure that we are sending a strong message, that we can disagree without being disagreeable, without questioning each other's motives. When we start caricaturing the other side, I think that's a problem. Unfortunately, we've got, as I said before, a 24-hour news cycle where what gets you on the news is controversy. What gets you on the news is the extreme statement. The easiest way to get 15 minutes on the news, or your 15 minutes of fame, is to be rude. And that's something that I think has to change, and it starts with me, and I've tried to make sure that I've sent a clear signal, and